Hello and welcome everyone to our Salary Band workshop today, online event. We're going to wait a few seconds for a lot of people to join in. We have a high number of registrations, so might as well wait a few seconds for all of them to come in. And in the meantime, you can say in the chat, you can say hi, where you're dialing from, since we have a very international based audience today. So very happy to see where people are connecting from. Don't hesitate to say hi in the chat. Before we just get started, right? It's going to be 1 hour and a half. Right, this is the second time in the history of Figures we do a 1 hour and a half workshop style online event. It's going to be very intense, I swear. So I hope you have your mug of coffee ready, water, everything you need, because after this 1 hour and a half, you're going to be sick and tired of hearing about salary bands. But hopefully, luckily, and I'm very confident that this is the case, you'll feel a lot more at ease with managing salary band in your own organization. So while everyone is connecting, I want to remind you all, this is part 1 of a 2-part series webinar, because as we felt 1 hour and a half was not enough to cover everything, we felt we needed 2 sessions of 1 hour and a half to cover at length everything you want to know about managing salary band within your organization, right? So we're going to put the link to part 2 of the webinar in the chat right now, which Nick just did. I mean, you can decide at the end of this webinar whether you want to join part 2 or not, or if you're sick and tired of listening, of talking about salary band. But if you haven't subscribed to part 2, I suggest you subscribe to part 2 straight away right now, because we're not going to cover everything today. We don't have the time to cover everything today. Second thing, this webinar is titled How to Maintain and Share Your Salary Band in Your Organization. And it's not how to create salary band within your organization. Like, we're really going to focus on post-salary band creation phase. Once you've created your first set of salary band, how do you maintain them? How do you update them? How do you communicate, share them, and leverage them in all of your HR processes, right? If you want more information, if you're at your beginning of your journey when it comes to salary band and you want to know how to create them, we're going to put the link to part 1 of the event. Part 1 of the event, which was a few months ago, during which we taught people how to create your first set of salary band. So same thing, Nick is going to share in the chat. If you're looking to create salary band, watch part 1, and then you're going to come back to this session afterwards, which allows me to answer one of the questions in the chat. Yes, this session is recorded. Yes, you're going to receive the replay of this session. So if you drop in alpha into it, you can come back. But once again, key point, if you're here to learn how to create your first set of salary band, you're a bit new to the topic, watch what Nick just put into the chat right now, which is just getting started with salary band. Watch this replay right there. Having said that, let's get right into it. And for this webinar, I've been talking the whole time, but I'd say that I'm very happy that we get to welcome Marie with me on stage. Marie, introduce yourself to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, by the way. Really looking forward to this whole session. Yes, it's going to be a long one, but I think it's going to be an exciting one. As the sign up sets, there's a large interest in this topic, so I think we have a lot to cover. Let's get going. So a little bit about me. Some of you might know me already, have heard of me before. I am a compensation in HR consultant, as well as a fractional head of HR, which essentially just means interim, so don't be put off by the term fractional. I'm based in Berlin. I was also born and raised here, so a true original. I did my studies in London. After I was born and raised here, I started my career at Google about exactly 11 years ago at this point. So time flies when you're having fun. And already at Google, as well as my other employments after, like SoundCloud, for example, I was always involved in compensation topics. So at Google, for example, it was interesting. I was also involved in compensation operations, which essentially means preparing compensation offers for recruiters to give to new candidates. At SoundCloud, I continued my journey. So I moved back to Berlin in 2015. For Google, I was in Dublin, so a little bit colder weather. I had a little bit of enough of that after London and Dublin, so back to back to not long sleeve weather. I was at SoundCloud for a little over 2.5 years, and also had the responsibility for all reward, compensation, benefits topics there, and was at Billy as VP People in my last employment before I started my own consulting business. I'm a one-person show. I've been consulting for the past 4.5 years, and yeah, really dived into the whole compensation topic, and Figures is one of the partners on my journey.
Thanks a lot, Marie. And I can say that we decided to do this webinar with Marie because we know that she's been advising a high number of our clients with a very, very high success and satisfaction rate. So I'm very happy that we get to get such an expert with us today on this webinar. And when I mean with us, I mean with kind of myself, like I was like with us, like Figures in general. I was not referring to us as myself. For my part, so I've been working in HR for a bit over 11 years. I started in compensation and benefits. I started my career and I worked in Comp and Ben for quite a while, right? But then I did more generalist HR role in organization of 50 employees up to 30,000 employees. And I created Figures a bit more than 3 years ago to create the compensation management solution I would have loved to have back when I was in HR. So I'm not really doing HR anymore. I'm more supporting you all into being the best people experience professional, people analytics professional you can be. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover like everything you want to know about SalaryBen and more. But more in detail, we're going to cover a lot of things. We're going to cover a lot of topics that come up when it comes to SalaryBen, like how to manage, when to create SalaryBen, how to manage them, when to review them, a whole bunch of topics that we're going to cover. We're not going to cover all of them today, right? We've run this session once, live, not online. It took us approximately more than 3 hours. So we're going to cover half of it today and half of it during the next session that you can register to, right? So today, the goal is to go through half of those topics, keep time for Q&A, and then cover the remaining half of those topics during the next session. Why 3 hours? Because this is such a complex topic, and we didn't want to do a like 45 minutes to 1 hour webinar covering just some of the high-level details. We really want it to be super actionable for you all. Like we want all of you to get out of this session and the following session feeling like you've learned stuff that you can apply like directly in your day-to-day job, right? And feedback from the first session was that we did a pretty good job at that. So hopefully we'll do as good of a job today. One quick thing. It's a long session. It's going to be, as I said, quite detailed. We want it to be lively. So please ask questions in your chat. We're going to take as many questions as we can, right? During the whole workshop. We have a Q&A at the end. Some of the questions might belong to the topics we're going to cover next time. In that case, we say, hey, please reconnect next time. But please ask as many questions as you want, as you can, especially covering the topic we're going to cover right now during this session today. And Marie and I will do once again the best job we can to try to cover your question as we go. Let's get started, folks. Buckle up. Before getting into SalaryBen, we felt it was important to keep context in mind, right? Not everyone is from Europe right now, but even if you're not from Europe, even from the US, you might have noticed a trend that won't go away of pay transparency laws hitting the globe, starting with the US, or in fact, starting with some other countries like some of the Nordic countries a while ago, a few years ago, hitting the US approximately last year, and now coming into Europe in play within the next few years. Pay transparency laws are coming and are going to force organizations to be more transparent about pay. Right? I won't go into the details on what those laws cover in the US or what they cover in Europe and so on, but this is a trend that won't go away. There's going to be more and more transparency mandated by law and pushed by market practices, meaning companies are starting to adapt already. This is not going away. So if you're responsible for compensation in your own company, you have to prepare for what we call this pay transparency here. You have to prepare for sharing your salary bands outside your organization, sharing your salary bands within your organization, being more and more transparent about compensation, right? So I think it's going to change a lot of things about compensation, especially my big belief is that you need to think, when you think of compensation, your new North Star is going to be you need to be able to justify every compensation decision that is made within your organization. Right? Why? Two things. One, once again, when you look at the European Pay Transparency Directive that's coming, by law, you will have burden of proof if one of your employees accuses you of pay discrimination to come up with proof that all of your compensation decisions you've made in the history of your employee was justified by objective and not discriminatory reason. So just from a legal perspective, you better be sure that any decision you make right now come up with a set of reason and justification that you could push to a court of law tomorrow. But more than the legal reason, if you think about the consequences of this pay transparency era, you're going to be challenged a lot more by candidates and about employees about, hey, how fair am I paid overall? How fair am I paid compared to my peers? Why am I underpaid compared to everyone else on the same role? Why did I receive an increase of 2% when everyone in the team received 4% of more? If you can't answer those questions, besides the legal liability, you will have engagement, retention issues, right? That's really important. So I think you need from now on to be like, every compensation decision I make, from the hiring point onwards, like the compensation offer you make to a candidate is a compensation decision. Why did you offer this candidate this amount? Why did you increase this person this amount? You need to be able to justify each of those decisions. So I think this is a North Star for this webinar. We get back to this quite a bit, but it's also, I think, a North Star for you all in your day-to-day job, justifying all of your compensation decision.
Absolutely. And before we jump into the next topic, get started with the salary bands topic in particular, what I think is so interesting about this directive is that most companies that will have, dealt with the compensation topic before and even just put down, a compensation philosophy or even a total rewards philosophy will probably already hit a lot of the check marks that they need to check when it comes to the directive. So it's all about, where do you position yourself in the market? Do you have salary events? What's the process? What benchmarks are you using? So if you already have dealt with the topic before, which most of you will have, because again, this webinar is about how to maintain and develop your salary bands rather than building them from scratch, you might already have a lot of these things in place. And I think like with many things in HR, it's always good to keep in mind, if things were completely transparent, any decision that you're making, can you stand behind it? So that's always a really good, I guess, mantra to have in anything you do in an organization, but especially with compensation. If people were to find out, can you stand behind it? Is there a rationale? I think that's, good to apply across the board.
100%. All right, let's get right into it. Keeping that in mind, right? North Star, we need to be able to justify each of those decisions. Coming over to you, Marie. Can you talk us about salary band? When do they come into play? What stage of the company and so on?
Sure. So my work has been pretty interesting. Maybe what you saw from my CV, I've worked in companies like Google that are really, really large and probably have a lot of these structures already in place and tools and automations and processes. But most other companies, maybe they're just starting out, maybe they don't have everything in place. So it's interesting to see, and I want to give you an overview of how this topic can actually develop, what structures you use, what frameworks, what data sources, etc. But maybe before we get into that, it's good to have a rough understanding of what the stakeholders involved are when you're actually setting up and maintaining salary bands. So usually, very typically, it starts with the HR department. It depends again on how large your HR department is. If it's rather small, it might be HR business partners actually taking care of the topic. If it's even smaller than that, it might be something like people operations. If it's larger and, probably after a size of like 250 or larger, companies will start investing and hiring compensation experts. And once you're really, really large, let's say 500, 600, 700, you really, really should. So those would be the people that put together the first drafts of what salary bands might look like. So again, as a reminder, how do you define salary bands? It's always per particular job, per particular level in any particular location. And there again, you might have different career tracks from manager to IC, supporting staff, as well as maybe project-based employees. Then you always want to get input from other stakeholders as well. So like with most things in HR, and that's what makes HR so interesting, but also so hard and maybe sometimes annoying a little bit, is that everyone has an opinion on it, right? So you want to get input from different stakeholders as well, especially the ones that are maybe closest to candidates that you're obviously trying to attract, with those salary bands that you're setting up through the offers that you're giving them, and make sure they're actually a success. So you definitely want to get feedback on the salary bands and where you benchmark them from the talent acquisition function, as well as hiring managers, and probably also heads of departments and any other key stakeholders you can think of. What you really don't want to happen is build something in vacuum, present that to recruiters who will then have to use the salary bands when they're preparing offers for candidates. And then all of a sudden they realize this is actually not at all the feedback that they're receiving from candidates and not able to secure them. So you want to get that fixed beforehand.
Yeah, well,
Finally,
jumping in
last
on
steps.
that, jumping in on that, Marie, because I think what you just said is probably one of the biggest reasons of failure for adoption of salary band within the company. I said maybe number one is this one. When you get the HR team working on defining those salary band without checking stakeholders like TA and managers, rolling them out, and being TA being like, this is nonsense, like this doesn't fit to what I see on the market. A manager being like, I haven't approved this, and it's just change management 101, right? It's key stakeholders that you need to get on board as early as possible. If you fail that, like it's one of the biggest reasons for failure. And that applies for creation, but any structural changes you make in terms of philosophy or to salary band moving forward, and we're going to talk about like managing salary band, you need to have those stakeholders management. I really think it's number one reason for failure of adoption of salary band within a company.
Totally. Yeah, you really need the buy-in, especially from the departments and the hiring managers that also have to, then manage the people you gave those compensation offers to. And obviously, as the last steps, you might want to get finance involved, for budget reasons, or just as a general check before the execs, CEOs, founders, etc., finally sign it off. But there's also different approaches to how you actually build salary bands, depending on maybe how large your company is or what resources you have to invest in it. So maybe to give you an idea of what it looks like in a scaled company, usually scaled companies will have fully invested. They might have a team that isn't just comprised of compensation expert, maybe also benefits experts, ESOP experts, etc. And they will usually have fully integrated benchmarking salary review tools. So what that means is you'll have a tool that's a database. We're actually gathering the different compensation data points. You'll also have a tool that you can use for doing salary reviews rather than doing it manually. And there it's always interesting to see what sources you choose. So there's different types of compensation databases you can use, more traditional ones, like I'm going to name a few competitors, forgive me, Virgile, but there might be, but also that puts in a good light because there's been some really great developments in the compensation benchmark tool landscape in the past few years. Traditionally, the more traditional ones like Aon, Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, etc., they're doing a really good job, and they might even have compensation benchmarking data for specific industries, like the Comtrix database from Mercer that's focused on tech industries, etc. And you can filter them by company size, funding stage, etc. Most tools will provide that. However, how they function is that they will usually have their clients provide their data to add to their pool, and they only have to submit them once a year. So that means that the data you're actually using in the tool might be outdated. So it's always something to keep in mind when you're going for maybe more traditional providers, that this is not live data. Other providers, maybe more current ones like Figures, provide live data that they feed in. So ideally, once you're scaled, you have this all automated. You also manage salary reviews through an automated process. Usually the steps before that look a little bit more like this. So on the manual approach, and also in the clients that I work with a lot of the times, the question is, oh, maybe we don't have the budget, because also compensation data and tools come at a certain price. From my experience, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Virgile, it's somewhere between like €1 and €4 a month per employee. So it can get expensive quite quickly, especially once you already have a certain tool landscape and additional costs on band. However, you can start out with something as simple as this. So you have the midpoint, minimum, max, maybe not even varying ranges of salary bands, but really you just go from 80 to 120, the most basic form. Obviously, this can be more sophisticated, and this is where great providers like Figures can support you, and consultants like me, of course, as well. You might have a split between individual contributor roles versus manager roles. And also there, it's interesting, there's actually some companies, like when I was working for SoundCloud back in the day, they made a conscious point to make sure that whether you were a manager or an individual contributor, the salary ranges actually didn't differ. To incentivize people or not to incentivize people to absolutely want to become a manager, even if they don't necessarily have the skill set or the passion for that, but to really make it an even playing field. But it can look something like this. You have the midpoint, and from that you calculate the total range. And the You can, of course, buy compensation data from external, but there's also some, other sources you can use to build your first salary ranges. As I said, recruiters always have a really good idea of where the market is at for any particular role, any particular point in time, because they're talking to the candidates, right? They do get the immediate feedback of maybe other offers they're getting. They do have the feedback of whether they'd be able to secure them with the offer you're giving them or not. HR business partners is another great source, the finance department, hiring managers, of course, the experts in the actual field that know how, jobs in their field might have developed over time, as well as heads of departments and others. There's also other free subscriptions maybe you can get to compensation tools. So, for example, a year ago, Ravio and Pave were still offering free subscriptions. I think they've stopped that now. But always the caveat is you'll always have to share your own data. And that's the case with most providers. But most tools that are just starting out and building their own compensation database pool will kind of, get you in by offering their tool for free, but also obviously always requiring you to share that data, which if it's an integrated solution, so you can directly hook up to the tool, is done automatically. All that needs to be done then is to match your jobs with their jobs at the right level so the data is actually accurate. It's not quite as easy with older providers like Aon and Mercer, for example, where all this still needs to be done manually. There's also other sources you can use, like salary surveys, for example. VCs and other investors, often do surveys with their own portfolio companies. And so, for example, Rocket X in Germany has great compensation surveys for the most standard types of departments you can find. So marketing, HR, not too detailed, but they might still have a pool of data for you to tap into before you make the investment of actually getting a tool. One thing I will say, though, and I'm sure, Virgil, you might have some opinions on that as well, when companies start using sources like Glassdoor, for example, obviously there's a lot of free data out there, but be careful. Because they're self-reported, you're not always quite sure how sound and valid the data always is. People type into the tool, whatever they want to get some data out of it, which might be, just an entry criteria, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the data is clean, accurate, etc. So at the end of the day, once you have the budget, once you have people who are actually proficient in using compensation, you can always get support from external and how to actually set that up. It's good to invest in a tool. So I'll pop it over to you, Virgil, to maybe give an example of what that can look like in an automated solution.
Yeah, I can share about what an automated solution to SalariBand look like. There was a question before, and I think that was quite interesting from Joe Villa. Was like, what's the criteria that we may keep in mind when benchmarking? Which was, I think, lots of it you covered, like free versus paid versus more reference database. One thing on that, though, the difference also between like free solution, like Glassdoor and so on, and like trusting some of the solution, of course, like figures. One of the key things I hear from our clients is sometimes not necessarily the data, but having a argument of authority when negotiating with candidates or managers. Managers that come to you and like, oh, all of my employees are underpaid and so on and so on. You're like, hey, we're using services of a company like Figures. This is what they say. Don't trust sometimes your employees telling you that they're refusing those huge offers elsewhere. Relying on a trustworthy source of data enables to cut down on some of those discussions. So I think it was interesting to mention. Beside that, any other criteria? And I think there was one interesting question from Jovila on who should we benchmark against, right? There's always this topic on who you should benchmark against. I used to say a lot of companies are tending to benchmark with direct competitors, like they're a health tech company in Germany and so on. And when hiring, and they're like, we want to benchmark ourselves only versus health tech company. My question to them is always, for some roles, I guess it makes sense. But for developers, are the developers that choose to work for you only choosing between health tech companies? Exactly. I don't think so. Where are you getting? So I think it's where are you competing for talent against overall and on some specific role. And like from developers, if you hire developers from some other type of companies and so on, then those are your competitors. Those are your competitors for talent. You should compare yourself against company you're competing with when it comes to talent, not necessarily business, right? That's my take. Totally. I don't know if you have any other addition to that.
Yeah, actually, exactly what I'm experiencing from my clients as well. So usually there's some filters that they will apply. It might be, companies in the general tech, SaaS, software space, just to kind of have a rough definition, because there might be some differences indeed between new economy, old economy, etc. Maybe company size to some extent. And in terms of where you benchmark yourself, so what percentile of the market data you want to benchmark yourself against, Just an example, so Google back in the day, at least when I was working there, they would benchmark themselves against the 90th percentile, but it's also important to keep in mind, what do they what do you actually include in that? So is it just base salary, or is it all the other benefits that they're offering as well? So you can easily get sidetracked with that. Most companies therefore decide to only focus on compensation. So that includes base salary and any bonuses in terms of target-oriented bonuses. They're comparing themselves on that. And then the question is, do you want to compare yourself on the midpoint? That's maybe where some companies start out, especially when they're still pretty young and maybe not as competitive. But then the more competitive ones usually benchmark themselves against 60th, 75th percentile. Unlikely higher than that unless you really want to dominate the market. But there again, it doesn't mean you have to benchmark every single role in every single country at the same benchmark. Some really differentiate. So for really particular roles, they might benchmark at a higher percentile. For not so competitive roles where it's easy to get the talent in the market, they might go for a lower one. But what you really don't see is people applying all the different filters you find in all the different tools, of going for exactly the same funding stage, etc., because it gets a little bit too complex. And also there might just be a finite number of data out there, so you don't want to skew that too much by filtering down on too much level.
Thanks for that, Marie. Getting back on track on our approach to salary bands. So Marie just showing an example of Excel-based or spreadsheet-based salary bands, right? Which is what I've been working with for years. And of course, I'm biased, but one of the reasons we've created a salary bands module in Figure to manage, to create, update, and share your salary bands is the limitation of such a system. I think come mostly when it comes to the sharing of salary band. So what's important, this is why we created a salary band solution in Figure. In Figure is mostly for the sharing part, right? So this is a screenshot of our solution. Maybe we'll go look at it a bit more in details. But what I found here as an HR director, especially when I was in Criteo, when we had a lot of managers being like, hey, can you share the salary bands for my roles with me? And where are my employees within my salary band? I used to do that with spreadsheets. So I was duplicating my main salary band spreadsheet with my employees in those spreadsheets. I was removing all the other salary band, and I would share with the manager just his salary band with his direct report. And I had like dozen, 20, 30, 40 of those spreadsheets flying around. And I think it was a nightmare. And I think, once again, moving forward in this pay transparency era, you're going to have to share your salary bands more and more with managers, with employees, and so on. And we created a solution in Figures that enable you to do that. So I won't expand too much, but most of the value comes with the sharing. In Figures, you can share some of the salary bands to managers, and they can see only their salary bands, like for their direct report, and only the direct report position within the salary band. But you can start with Excel, but I think when it comes to spreading salary bands throughout your organization, Excel and spreadsheet and Google Sheet have some limitation.
Totally.
Maybe you want to talk about that more, Marie?
Sure. Yeah, but maybe just the last point on that one, what you see is that even in HR departments, salary ranges often don't get shared with the whole HR department altogether. It usually really is on a need-to-know basis. So that might be hiring, recruiters, but really only for the roles that they're recruiting for. Especially, team internal salary bands, you wouldn't necessarily share them either. And the same for hiring managers in other departments. So it's also really prone to error, especially once you have a large organization, really well-defined and detailed salary ranges, accidentally sharing a sheet, etc. So a tool, like with most areas, can really make sure you waste less time on it. And I guess we can go to the next slide because I'm already covering these points.
Yeah, sorry.
So advantages. So advantages of using a compensation tool really is it saves you time in the long run, and also cost savings, right? Even though tools can be costly, imagine the time you have to invest in getting someone who's educated in this area to actually spend their time. You're spending salaries on people actually administrating that whole thing, and HR in itself is always admin heavy. So having good structures, processes, and automations really makes a difference. Again, it's also nice for people who are looking after this area to have as few tedious manual tasks as possible. That also often leads to having fewer errors, and tool integration is always the important part here, right? So whatever you add to your tool stack, make sure ideally you're going for a provider that integrates well with other tools you already have on board, because ideally it will automatically pull the information, so the salary data of your existing employees, so you can then maybe use it to build the salary ranges or actually do the salary reviews with that. And the same way the other way around. So ideally you then do all the changes, maybe salary adjustments in the tool, and they automatically get pushed back to your HRIS, so you don't have to do manual uploads, downloads. I've had to do that my whole career. So I remember like once at SoundCloud, you push the wrong button, everything is wrong, and then there's no way to remove it. So everyone sits there for a couple of hours correcting manually, which is quite stressful and unfortunately a little bit of a waste of time. But then maybe on the downsides, again, of course, there's a certain amount of cost associated with tools. As I said, from my experience, it's usually between €1 and €4 per employee per month. So, in a company that's maybe 500-700 employees large, you'll easily get to maybe 5, 10, even 20,000 euros a year, which, in the greater scheme of things, maybe isn't that big, but usually takes a little bit of convincing an internal business case and buy-in from the right stakeholders to actually get that improved. With any tool, there's time to implement, but also maintain. So it's always important to keep in mind with anything that you implement, you also have to train people. You need to have someone who maintains the thing. So even if your provider, like Figures, for example, will help you, onboard you in the tool, after a while, obviously going to keep on supporting you, but you need to have the people internally who actually are responsible for pushing this forward. The worst thing that can happen is that you have a great tool and it keeps developing, adding new features, and you don't know anything about it. I've seen that all too often with people then being unhappy with certain tools and actually weren't aware of all the features that were added since they last looked at it. And obviously, maybe there's a point at some point that your company has outgrown the existing tool solution that you have. So then obviously, once you have a tool, you might want to keep one, but maybe have a different one. So reviewing, swapping tools, or even renegotiating contract terms is a little bit time intensive. But ultimately, I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And just to highlight the alternatives to general COM tools once more, you can obviously also build tools in-house or automations and manual workarounds. I've seen that happen. Even at Google, they used to have the HR tools that they were built in-house. It can work, even with the greatest engineers in the world, but it usually gets to a scale where your company also doesn't want to use its main resources focused on something like that. So it's good to always go for external experts that spend, their life and business passion on these topics rather than trying to come up with, automations yourself. And you always have to get someone from engineering over to help you with these things, even though they're probably busier building the actual company's product, if that makes sense.
I think it does. One quick note, I'm noting down, you might see some reaction on some of the questions that I think are really interesting. There was a question for William, for example, on handling exceptions that we're going to cover. So when I make a reaction on some of them, some googly eyes, it means we're going to get back to those later on, right? Some of those we answer on the go, and some of those questions, some of your questions that you can ask in the chat, we're going to cover later on, either during the specific question or during the Q&A. Now we wanted to get to one of the most asked question when it comes to salary band, which is the question of salary band overlap. But before we talk about salary bands overlap, let's talk about one key topic that's very much associated with salary bands overlap, which is the notion of salary band width. So how large should be the salary bands and your salary bands with your organization? So first of all, I don't think there's an absolute truth to what they should be, right? Yet, my personal belief is that the best practice should be, you should have your bands should be as narrow as possible when it comes to more entry-level roles like beginner, junior, and so on, and get to as large and larger as seniority goes. Why? Because at an entry level, in roles that are designed for people to stay 2-3 years at most, it doesn't make a lot of sense for me that on a given role, there should be huge salary band. That someone starting on the same role with zero experience at all, packages could be different from plus or minus 20%. So I think it makes a lot of sense to start with narrow salary bands and increase the width of salary bands as we go. So we made an example of junior level bands being plus or minus 7%, then 10%, 12, and so on. It's a good example of an increasing width with salary bands level, right? So I think that's the best kind of a best practice. I don't know if you agree with that or not, Marie.
Obviously, I generally agree. I think also another thing to keep in mind is not every role necessarily will move up to an exec level, right? So it's important to keep in mind there will be different tracks of people. There's going to be a manager track, an individual contributor track, so someone who's not a manager essentially, but there might also be additional tracks that you have for supporting staff, for example. Roles that really don't even make sense to have a lead role for. Often you'll find this in customer support or similar roles, but not necessarily only there, of course. So it's important to keep in mind for each track, you also need to make sure it makes sense for that particular career path. In general, it makes sense to keep it wider as you progress. And I think, are you going to go into a bit more into detail of like what the advantages and disadvantages are?
Like the salary, I'm going to go into the salary and overlap one. So like
exactly. So we'll go into more detail to that. But yes, even though I have to say, traditionally, most companies start out with the same range for all the different roles. And I just say it's probably no disadvantage to that. It's probably a good way to, in general, anything you implement in HR or other functions, I would say for that matter, start small and iterate. It's usually easier to have a simple process, a basic setup that you can then develop on. And also every company is different. So there's no one size fits all. And then you iterate as people get used to the framework, as you receive feedback from people, as you kind of progress. It's always trickier to have a fully fledged, super detailed, highly conceptualized process, get everyone used to it, train everyone on it, and then have to reverse everything once you realize it actually doesn't make sense. So it's also important, you know, in communicating once you build them and maintain them, that it's not necessarily all set in stone, you know, especially because it's a compensation topic and people are really attached, obviously they should be, right, to their compensation. You will encounter a lot of different voices and opinions. So leave yourself some room for maybe even negotiation or room for changes. But yes, eventually you should probably get to somewhere where the ranges change with width. It gives you more flexibility. It makes for a better employee experience as well.
Yep, agreed with that. And we're going to cover also again, like more evolution of salary bands in time and so on a bit later on, but fully agree with like Mari on the topic of like iterating, right? Starting with a set and just learning as you go and making changes as you go. So now that we've covered salary band widths, let's talk about salary bands overlap. So what's an overlap for people to...
I think maybe just one thing. We had a question from Nadia in the chat. Let's see. Let me add that here. How do you formally manage those employees who evolved as an IC, for example, IC level 6, and now jump into a first leadership role, M3, for example? In my opinion, they should not reduce their salary from level 6 to 3. So once you move to manager track, how do you administer them? Do you keep the level info for both parts, for example? And this is the highest number wins. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about like IC3, so individual contributor 3, and IC6 and M3, it implies that's a jump to a certain manager role, which implies a jump down in level. I've been dealt with my career more of equality of roles. Like if you are an IC6, you will go to equivalent type of role, so they will never see that type of issue. Usually, and you mentioned that, I've seen something you mentioned earlier on, Mari, like working organizations that aligned pay between individual contributor and manager at the same level. So for example, a level 4 will be a senior or a team lead, a M4 will be a team lead, and a IC4 will be a senior or something like that. And therefore there was equality in ranges in both roles. And actually we might get to that in the Q&A, but I've changed stances in the like aligning bands between manager and individual contributor roles at a similar level. I'm now more in favor of differentiating band at a similar level, but we could talk about that in the chat. But so in your situation, I've not seen it much, but in any other situation where you have someone moving to another role, which the band is lower than the previous role, usually I've very, very rarely seen a drop in compensation. I've seen it once, in fact. But usually you keep them with their package on the new band, even though you make them out of bands, like above the bands they are now in. And we're going to have a section on how to manage out of bands employee later on, but that's how I would manage it. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally. And to be honest, again, it's important to keep in mind, whatever you decide on doing, make sure it's consistent across the company. So there's fairness and alignment and people know what to expect, especially within the people who are actually decision makers. Make sure you can stand behind every single decision, but keep in mind, you might do it differently from a competitor, you know, that you're also looking into how they're setting up their processes. You can obviously always use the compa ratio, you know, placing them exactly on the same compa ratio in a different range. Usually I would say when you're switching from IC to a manager track, they might start you off on the lower end of the track because you're still building your expertise, you know, might not be fully performing in that particular role yet. But again, you see companies really, you know, some want to keep it very similar. It's also important to keep in mind, you know, how do you want to incentivize people? Do you want to incentivize people to become managers? Do you want to compensate them for that, etc., etc.? But yeah, very interesting question. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think the follow-up question, and then there was another interesting question, and we'll get to move. But okay, they were a very high level IC role and they get to the equivalent level would be too high, then you promote them to a lower level, which I think made sense. But then compensation-wise, I still think you fall into the category of having them into a band that below and then being out of band. And then we're going to have a section on how to manage out of band employees, like the ones paid above the pay grade they're in. But it's a bit tied to William's question on how to manage like super exceptions. And we're going to cover them a bit later on. And I think that was interesting, this question. And before moving to the overlap part on Jovita and like what happens to the roles, there's no progression to the exec level. And you talked about this, Marie. And I think it's this is where salary bands are in fact interesting as a way to say, you know what, maybe there's not a path in customer support role to the exec level. And you're going to stagnate because it doesn't make sense from an organizational design point of view for a company to have like a super high level customer support role. And therefore, I think it's a good thing that the message might be from a salary band perspective. Yep, senior customer support person is the highest level role we have. If you actually want to progress in salary or in the company, it has to be through a different route within the company. So in fact, in a way, I used to, by design, when creating salary ranges, be like, if I was to share that, like this is an example of a salary range, right? I would, by design, show salary range, for example, that would cap out at intermediate level. And if anyone could be, does it mean that I can't earn more than 72K in terms of account management, right? Yes, there's nothing above intermediate level. And if you're at the high end of the intermediate level right here, then it means that there's no room for promotion on this role. You need to look outside the company. And I think it's a good message to send, and it's a fine message to send.
Totally.
Getting back
I would
to
also
the
just like to add,
Mike.
maybe just one more point. It's always important to keep in mind also when you're promoting people or offering, parallel moves. Yes, people probably deserve the promotion or the change in roles and the career development, but it always needs to be also a consideration of, is there a business need? Companies generally don't just promote people, up and up and up the career ladder, even they might have developed. Obviously, you can do it maybe more easily on the salary part when you have wide enough ranges, like Vigier was just showing. But general practice is not everyone gets promoted to the next level, because if there is no business need for that particular role on that particular level, it will be hard to justify to have everyone progressing up, because then what you end up having is really like a belly in the middle of the company of people being a senior, maybe director level or advanced level, and that's really not sustainable. You need to kind of have a little bit balanced out depending on the company needs as well.
There was 2 questions now, and I haven't forgotten you, Clayton, and Webker, on like communicating salary ranges. So it's a topic for next time. We might do a spoiler, a bit of a teaser in the Q&A later on, because there's a lot of questions on that. And I can share, we can share with Marie some of our personal belief around sharing salary ranges, and I can share also some success stories from some of our clients. But moving back to the overlap question, right? Once again, we've discussed what salary bandwidth. What's an overlap? An overlap is when a band, overlaps with the level above or the level below, right? So in that case, you see that between the junior and the intermediate level, the salary band don't overlap. And you see that between the intermediate and senior level, in that case, there is a salary band overlap, which means that when there's salary band overlap, you can have the case of what you're saying here, an intermediate level employee being paid more than a senior level employee, right? So is that a good or a bad thing? It's it'd be easy if there was, as always with HR, there's very rarely always right type of options, right? There's really like, this is the way you have to go. So how do you approach this problem? The advantages of salary band overlap is that you have more flexibility. It's really the key. In fact, the advantage of an overlap and large salary bandwidth is flexibility. It gives you more room and flexibility to go, right? The more flexibility for a superstar employee to move from one level to another, more flexibility when you have someone that might take time to be promoted to the next level, but could be increased progressively within their own level before jumping, right? And more flexibility for people that in fact either can't or won't want to be promoted, right? Because if you link, and we're going to talk about compensation reviews and salary bands, right? If you see that career, like compensation progression can be done only within your own band, if you have a narrow salary band, there's not a lot of room for progression, once again, right? When there's a large salary band, there's a lot more room for progression. So it's all about flexibility in that case. Meanwhile, the issues with overlap, the first one is like the perceived issue of fairness, right? If we go back to the example we had just beforehand, it could be said that it's unfair for this intermediate level employee to be paid less than a senior level employee doing on the same role, right? So people could be like, wait, that's not fair. And in fact, the other issue is that if you talk about promotion, some cases like that, you might not have a big jump if you get promoted to the next level because you're being the employee is already kind of being promoted at a similar level than the next level. Meanwhile, in more narrow salary band, there's a lot more, the steps are higher between levels, and therefore the promotions is more impactful. So if we go visually, in a way, if we share back some of that example here, if we have very narrow salary bands, right? If you have very narrow salary band, if I get promoted from the beginner level to the junior level, there is a big jump, right? There's a jump, there is a significant jump when I get promoted. On the contrary, what I was saying, the lack of flexibility means someone staying into a band like that doesn't have much room because the room is super narrow to progress, right? Meaning maybe after 1 or 2 increases, you're stuck at the top of the salary range. And therefore, if you don't get promoted, you might not get an increase at all or a very slow increase. We'll get back to that into how we use salary band and compensation review. It might lead to frustration, right? So once again, the way I like to prevent the salary band is like large salary bands that overlap is more flexibility, some potential fairness concern or some potential, once again, if you get back to the slide, some concern that promotion might not lead to a big significant jump. But on one thing, before I let Marie share our thoughts, right? On the first downside, potential fairness challenge, I've lived with overlapped salary band my whole life, in fact, and still at Figures, the one we implemented have overlapped. The way I view things, when it comes to the disadvantage of someone being paid more than someone one level above, or the downside of a promotion, one way I like to put it is a lot of time in most roles, when you get promoted, you don't suddenly from one day to the next come back like just 2 centimeters taller, a lot wiser, a lot stronger because you were promoted the previous day. So there's, in fact, from someone who's very senior at the intermediate level and someone who's just starting out in the senior role, is there that much of a huge gap? No. So I think it's fine for very, very senior intermediate employees to be paid nearly the same or just slightly above some very junior senior employees. And I've worked in organizations. I know some founders that are like, salary bands overlap is hell, it shouldn't happen, it's a sin. I've worked in an organization where it was commonly accepted and it was not too much of an issue. So, but once again, it's a company decision. My take is that it's fine having some form of an overlap. It gives me as a HR professional or ex-HR professional more flexibility, but I can understand organizations that are not fine with this. Marie, what do you think?
Yeah, totally. I think maybe when people or companies first start out using salary bands, usually they're like a very clean cut from one to the next. Once they start using it, maybe they realize, there is some limitations to that. So I definitely agree the overlap, taking kind of the fear out of it and maybe giving it a shot can really help. What you mentioned with the salary increases you give people, whether you give them a promotion at the same time or not, that really illustrates in any case, in any decision you make in the company, whether it's on compensation, other topics, you always need to keep in mind what is the history of that particular employee. Were they promoted recently? Does it make sense to give them a salary increase to the very end of the range or maybe even beyond, rather than looking at just that one snapshot now on this particular point in time. So how you structure salary reviews, and we'll get to that in a second, is really important. It's important to kind of look at the context of things, and it kind of sometimes makes, I guess, compensation more of an art than a science, and there's always a big discussion around what is it really, but it's important to really keep in mind, what are the scientific, the hard facts, the methodologies, the processes that you stick to, the key principles, the philosophy you want to follow, and how do you actually live it? How do you actually create a culture out of that? Obviously, in huge companies, especially, in consulting companies, etc., there will be a pure calculation of how your salary increase is calculated. Especially with smaller companies, you usually don't have that wide of a budget or that vast of resources and tools and analytical resources to help you, make sure that every single calculation is going to lead to the perfect answer. What the disadvantage of that also has is that it sometimes, creates a little bit of a very calculated approach from employees, and you really want to avoid that. You want it to be lived, you want it to be organic, you want it to feel, really and tap into the core of what you're trying to achieve, which is to see the individual and really, adjust to their in particular case. But I think we have some questions in the chat that might refer to that.
Yes, I think there was a question from Jovita that was interesting. Like, what if the market data shows actually a lot of distance between level? Should we match what market? And overall, I think I take Jovita's question as, what if market data shows a huge jump, but we will be more in favor for like close by salary bands? Like, what do we do? Do we stick with what market data shows us? Do we align to what we would like to do with like closer levels? How do you deal with sometimes market data showing? In fact, we could extend it to what do you do when market data shows stuff that you're not fully aligned with how you'd like things to be, right? Either like this data between one level to the other is super close when you'd like to have a more larger jump, or you'd like to have a closer jump, but market data shows a larger jump. How do you deal with that? It's not an easy question, right? But Marie, do you have any idea on how to handle this?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, it's always important. It's something I try to tell, companies I work with on a daily basis. So even those already using, benchmarking providers, often their expectation is you'll buy compensation data, you'll, purchase a tool, you have access to their benchmarking, salary and compensation data, and this will be the absolute truth. So once you have that access, every problem will be solved. And it really is a little bit of a fallacy in there. Ideally, also, most companies will use, when they have the resources, or depending on what the resources are in terms of budget, etc., like 1 to 3 resources to triangulate and get different points of input that then help them define their own salary ranges. So that's kind of where the art of compensation benchmarking comes into, and you can do this in a very easy way. Kind of pull the data, you put it all in a spreadsheet, you take the average. That's a very simple way of doing it, and then you adjust it to where you maybe want it to be based on your internal feedback that you're getting from recruiters, from hiring managers, etc. So the data you're buying is not the ultimate answer, and it really shouldn't be, because you might have also made maybe a slightly wrong assumption on exactly where you want to position yourself in the market. Maybe is it the 60th? Is it the 75th? And what the data shows you will also vary, probably depending on the type of role you're looking up, or the level you're looking up, or the career track. So it's always important to take that compensation data with a pinch of salt. If you see a massive jump, well, then maybe you don't want to put the benchmark on the lower level as low. Maybe you want to, adjust them a little bit closer to one another, and then use wide ranges to kind of bridge that gap. Maybe, there's what also some companies do is, rather than having, low hierarchy in a company, that then start adding other levels in between, so people can get promoted more faster, like they do in consulting companies, for example. And then you have smaller salary increases that come with that. So there's a way of kind of creating a structure and framework that really suits your company. The data is not the ultimate answer.
Yeah, and you'll always have to make trade-offs, right? And I think at times you're going to have to make trade-off with what market data shows you, even if you triangulate it, and what you want to do internally. And sometimes when you see that huge jump, to your question, will you want your bands to reflect that huge jump, or like you're not comfortable with that difference in pay, and we're going to have the... I apologize for that. For those who are familiar with that, this is a MacBook integrated, new integrated, whatever effects that Apple integrated. Like there's some very cool one. I can't remember what are the other ones. And whenever I do signs like overlapping salary bands, there's some stuff appearing. Maybe you're gonna have. Does it work? Okay. Well, you see some of those, right? Anyway, going back to what we were saying, right? Is like you're gonna have to make trade-off. Do we want to match that market data but have a gap between levels that we don't like, or do we want to maintain that gap but know that we're disaligned with market and potentially it's going to lead to talent attraction issues? There's no right or wrong answer, but you're going to have to make those trade-offs. Moving a bit ahead, when do we review our bands, right? One question, Marie. When should I've defined my salary band, I've decided of my salary band widths, overlap, no overlap, and so on. How often should I review my bands? What's your take?
Sure. Exactly. So this is also an important point to keep in mind with other HR processes that are going on at the same time. So usually what companies do is they'll first define the salary bands, before they have a performance review, before then they have the salary review. And we'll get to the salary review point in a second. So most companies will be doing performance reviews or developmental talks, feedback talks, whatever you want to call it, once or twice a year. In older economies, usually it's a year-end conversation, but usually for startups, scale-ups, that's not enough. The company moves too fast. There's need for feedback faster than that. Ideally, obviously, you'll give feedback on a more regular basis than that, but official kind of structures of how you do performance and development review, usually twice a year is a good average. And that is because, you know, some actually at SoundCloud, we tried once a quarter. The tricky part with that one is that, yes, your company might be moving fast, but there's almost not enough time for people to actually implement the learnings that they had to then get into the next performance conversation. So that's why usually also defining your salary bands is done once or twice a year by default. You need to plan enough time to do that. So ideally you have an idea of what the process will look like, what resources you want to use, etc. Because depending on that, it might go faster or slower. So for example, if you're really only using internal feedback as a reference for the salary ranges, you can probably get done in 2 weeks. But if you're still in a search for proper tool, looking for different surveys, etc., that might take longer. But apart from that, you can also do proactive salary band adjustments. And here it's really back to the point of what the real point of compensation structures, especially salary bands, really is. Because you want to attract people and retain them ideally. Obviously, you don't want to retain those that maybe aren't a great fit, but roughly that's what we're aiming for, right? So if you're noticing that you have high turnover in your company, your salary bands might be outdated. So you really want to avoid that being the reason, just because there's a structural stance in place that says we only update them once a year. If you really should update them, even if it's just for individual roles. You know, you particularly see with, for example, in marketing and engineering, developer relations is a role that's become significantly important. There's hardly any resources out there that have salary points on that, and they might change, quite quickly. Because there's high competition for these types of roles in the market. So you should definitely be proactive in adjusting them if need be. Same with offer acceptance, so giving offers out to candidates. And this is also why it's really important to stay in touch with your different stakeholders, especially recruiters. Their job is to apply the salary bands. Obviously, they'll stick to them. You should also get the feedback from them, whether they're still working or not, or if you're missing the point with the offers that they're giving out. Are you losing candidates because other companies are more on point with the salary bands that they're applying and are able to give out better offers? Obviously, you can also, do exceptions of, this is technically our range, but we really need this person. Again, there the main premise is, can you justify that decision? But again, there is nothing to say that you can't adjust salary bands as the year goes on. Quite the opposite, individual adjustments, whether you do them immediately or in the upcoming salary review, are a really important sign to existing employees, especially, that you're dealing with the topic, you're taking it seriously, and you're proactive about it. And it's a great way to build trust, because I can rely on your expertise in the field and your proactivity and the way you're taking it seriously to really make a change there. What you absolutely don't want to happen is people moving on from your organization. And unfortunately, this happens a lot. Employees will not necessarily bring up conversations like, hey, I'm not happy with my salary. Maybe they'll do it once and then give up. So you really want to be proactive about it. You want to be the one leading the conversation so that they don't get enticed to applying to other companies that might be further ahead in the game than you are. What's your take on this, Virgil?
Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of this point, because I've done that multiple times throughout my career. And what I mean by that is like realizing that we had a drop, where we had an increase in turnover due to compensation, or a drop in acceptance rate, basically being like, okay, there's something wrong with how we are aligned to the market on this role. So we're going to review those salary ranges. And then I guess I was lucky enough to be part of organizations. We had the budget and the leaders buy-in to be like, okay, I want to do proactive increases. So one example I'll say, for example, when I was at Criteo back in the day, I think it was 8 years ago, we had a huge increase in the DevOps type of market, right, at the time. So we had some of the DevOps getting poached, and we were positioned quite high in the market. And we're like, okay, there's something wrong. We need to review our bands. So basically, we reviewed the bands to be 10% higher than the rest of software engineers. And what we did then, which is tied to Olga's question, right? How do you deal with it, and what we just mentioned then? we had two choices. We're like, okay, now that we've moved the band, what do we do with current people in the band? Do we deal with that as the next compensation review, or do we do something proactive? I managed to free up budget, to lobby for proactive budget. And we went to a number of our DevOps and being like, hey, we just welcomed in, said, I guess we have a news for you. We just decided to proactively change our bands for the DevOps role, and therefore we decided to increase you by X% so that we ensure you're being paid fairly to the market and align with our compensation policy. And that type of stuff linked to what Mari was saying. And I did that once again more in my career. That type of stuff, when you go out to someone who hasn't requested everything, it's like, hey, we care about you being paid fairly. We care about being true to our word as a company. We've decided to increase you, generate so much trust in the sense that people are not like, hey, this is always a fight. I have to get what I'm worth. I have to go and interview at other roles, come back with job offers to my company in order to negotiate more increases and so on. It's like a negotiation, a fight, a battle. No, there's a systemic process in place to ensure fairness. And I've been beneficiary of an increase I didn't ask. It was huge in terms of trust, really, really huge, right? And I've done that multiple times, and I think it's one of the best high leverage type of stuff that we've done, right? I've done this in 2 other occasions. I like someone that hadn't even started in the company. Between the moment when I accepted the offer and we changed the salary ranges, we got back to someone who hadn't started being like, hey, remember we offered you 70K? In fact, we just reviewed our ranges. You're going to get 75K when you start. The impact of doing something to someone, the type of trust you generate is huge. So massive fan of doing, if budget allows, proactive compensation reviews.
Totally. And just on the point, I think, George, you had a question in the chat of whether we can elaborate on this last point. I think Virgil just did, right? It's very much a point of reviewing where you're at, estimating the risk, where do you even have the budget? Is there any unfairness in comparison to other employees? So obviously don't just focus on any particular role that you're potentially adjusting in terms of salary band. Try to have a look left and right as well to not miss anything. But yes, very much the idea is you need processes, you need principles and decision-making principles of how you deal with salary bands, but also compensation decisions. Don't be afraid of making exceptions. You'll likely have a greater win out of it, exactly like Vijay described, by having huge trust gain from employees when you demonstrate that you're proactive, rather than sticking to a framework kind of mindlessly just for the sake of it. I hope that covers it.
Yeah, and I think the key point you have more on top of that is like the key decision you have that impacts budget is you review your salary band in June, your next compensation review is in January. By changing the bands, you realize some people are like underpaid or below bands. Do you start to increase them now, or do you wait for the next compensation review? Those are the type of decision you have to make once you start changing those bands, right? And that's one of the trickiest decisions you can make. We're going to get to salary reviews. I think it's time that we start cover it a little bit more. I probably cover the end of it during the next workshop. So we're going to cover that, and then we're probably going to go to the Q&A to cover some of the questions and the thoughts-provoking questions and views in there, as Teresa said. Mari, go ahead. That's a scary slide. 12 steps salary review timeline. Go for it.
It is a scary process. So yeah, it definitely deserves it. And maybe whilst I'm talking, everyone else in the audience, come up with your questions. We want to use the time after that to really dig into whatever questions you may have left, ideally related to the topics we covered. There's a whole host of other topics coming in part 2. So we look forward to seeing you all there. But with regards to salary reviews, right? You've probably all been part of salary reviews at some point. Usually they take place, same to the adjustment of the salary bands, once or twice a year. It usually depends on how often you do performance or development reviews or feedback conversations. Obviously, with feedback conversations, they should ideally happen more often than that, but I really mean the formalized process that most companies will have, where you look past on past performance and you look forward into the future in terms of development, what happened, what goals were achieved, etc. And so as part of that, you really want to use that as a basis for salary reviews, and you really want the salary bands that you just defined to be ready in place to be applied. Now, the whole process can take, again, a large range of time. Keep in mind, usually doing performance reviews will take at least 2 to 4 weeks, I would say. Usually give people time just to do the performance review of typing their self-assessment, giving peer reviews, assessing their direct reports, or giving upward feedback. You usually give them about 2 weeks, right? The first week, no one does anything. The second week, everyone starts typing. So it's probably similar for salary reviews afterwards, because there's a whole host of steps that you need to keep in mind. But let's start at the beginning. First, finance and or HR will set the budget. That's an ideal scenario. I have to admit, a lot of companies I've worked with, they don't really work with budgets. Once you get larger, you'll have to, especially once, the finance department becomes more equipped. It usually sits within the financial planning and analysis team, so FP&A short. They will have a great overview of how the cost aspect of the company is developing, and they should do predictions. They should do a forecast on these things. Roughly 80% of the company's cost will be salaries. So that's why it's a huge amount of money that you're managing. So any increase, etc., will have its consequences. Again, you can manage that through sheets. We'll get into that in the next session. Tools like Figures give you a very automated way of doing that, which obviously makes the whole thing much easier. So first, you set a budget. Next is maybe a little bit of an unusual point, gathering employee expectations. The reason why I put this in here is because I have worked at companies where people got a promotion, got a salary increase, or not, and the employee who received them, even if it was technically very positive for them, felt so left out in the whole process that some of them actually also refused. I've worked at companies where people just flat out refused getting a promotion because they felt the whole process wasn't inclusive. Obviously, these might be very idealistic employees, but you can see how even with a positive outcome, it can really damage the relationship and kind of the buy-in, the trust, and the way people feel heard and have voice in any particular organization. So usually this happens through managers. It's a hard way to kind of figure out whether they've actually done this part or not. But the idea is that managers will have conversations with the direct reports, so the employees, the teams that they manage, maybe in a one-on-one, to at least get feedback from them on, hey, where you're standing right now with your salary, do you feel that's fair? Where do you see yourself in the future based on your performance, etc.? And then always to add, with most things that you talk about in HR, this is not a promise we'll be able to implement it. We just really want your input because it matters to us. So make sure you highlight this is not a promise. We just really want your input. Important in any HR scenario because you'll come around to bite you in the tail. All right, so next, already mentioned performance reviews and
one
calibrations.
One thing on that, though, if I may, Marie,
Go for
on the
it.
employee expectation, because it's an interesting one on which we've discussed, and an interesting example of not all processes and companies are doing the same thing. In my case, I don't want to ask employee expectation because I don't want to set the framework of this is a negotiation where you tell us what you want and we're going to react to that. Either react directly or indirectly, because if you ask an employee what they want, you realize they want 8%. And when you get to and we're going to get to like calibration and so on later on into this slide, right? And then you realize that the process dictates that they should get 4, you're biased because they want 8, and you might want to trick the process to meet their demand. And every time you start tendering more to what people request, you start bringing in negotiation. Negotiation creates unfairness. And it's one of the root causes of the gender pay gap. By the way, is a room left to negotiation because men negotiate more than women. So I'm trying to run processes. I've run processes the past 5 years, in fact, the past 8 years, that don't ask employees their expectation. But it can lead to disappointment such as you mentioned. But I feel like the most fair thing to do. But it can lead to going ahead, doing the salary review and offering someone 4% and be like, you know what? I wanted 8. You didn't ask me what I want. I'm pissed off. I'm going to leave. I feel like the greater good, my take is that the greater good, the greater process outweighs the needs of one individual. But once again, that's where it's an opinion and not a fact that this is the right way to go.
Totally. And I would say if you don't do it, probably communicating very well around the rest of the process, making people understand what the benchmarking process is, not necessarily sharing the benchmarks or the salary ranges, but you'll definitely need to pull your weight on the communication part so people feel somewhat in the know and it doesn't completely come out of the blue, and they feel like it was just a black box decision. So that may be just on that. Again, then the performance reviews happen. What I mean by calibrations is, again, this is something I can only highly recommend to every company out there. What you usually see happen with performance reviews, if managers don't calibrate amongst themselves, is that some managers might be more lenient than others and some others stricter. So they might still be applying the same rating scale or ways of feedback that you have. They might be interpreted differently. And then one team might be, rated more harshly than another. All of a sudden you have all, strong performers in one team rather than the other. And in these calibration conversations, managers from similar departments, ideally, or similar areas, should present their individual cases, discuss their individual team members, how they performed, etc., and potential also career development. Not necessarily salaries, but I feel all these conversations is a really good educational tool for managers to really develop their skills, get feedback from peers on how decisions are made in terms of how you can see your particular team members progress in the future, so that then once they make suggestions on what the salary increases for them could be, they have a very sound, I guess, background of information and discussion that they can use. Once managers make the suggestions, usually HR, heads of departments, execs will review the suggestions, and you always, always, always need to do a bias analysis. Again, yes. This is a case where a tool like Figures or any other tool can really make this easier, because otherwise you'll be typing, you'll be pivoting or whatever to figure out what are the biases in our pool. Obviously, you can do these types of bias analyses at any particular point in time, but you really want to make these analyses before you make final decisions. What is embarrassing as hell for companies if afterwards, and I've had this happen even with clients, employees will talk, and even if you think contractually you're not allowed to, I'm not even sure that's technically a thing by law.
That's going to go ahead with the directive, by the way. One of the things the directive is going to enforce, that's no clause preventing people from discussing who got paid. All those clauses will be outlawed.
Nice.
It won't be legal anymore to have a clause like that in your contract.
Totally, which is perfect. And to be honest, should be the case, right? I mean, it's their personal data at the end of the day. So what you really want to avoid is then rumors starting of, all women didn't really get an increase, etc. So you really want to be the one who is checking themselves before others are correcting you, which is always a good thing, right? People should speak up, but you'd rather not be caught out in having made a dramatic mistake like that. So there's different factors you can run the analysis on. Obviously, gender, men, women, diverse, whatever you may have, seniority levels. Are some people in more senior positions maybe preferred in terms of getting increases, in terms of their performance or average promotion rate that the individual employees might have, their job level, department, etc. And you might, try a couple of these demographics and see what's most relevant to you. Obviously, depends on also the values that you have and what you want to stand for, but it's good to do an all-round check just to make sure you didn't miss anything. But all too often, people are just happy that we finally got the new salaries in, managers were late, so let's just sign them off. Don't do that. Try to do a minimum amount of analysis. It's usually gender, maybe nationality, department, etc., just to make sure you didn't get caught up by anything.
And one thing on that, by the way, Marie, we're going to deep dive on bias analysis at the next session. That's George's question, right? And have some of the criteria you should look at, especially given we're right into compensation review time. Like a number of companies are going to be, maybe you're doing the compensation review within the next 2 months. And there's some absolute indicators that you need to follow. And Marie mentioned some of those, but like average increase of men and women, median increase of men and women, velocity promotion rate for both, and having a look at some of those things during the campaign instead of after is a must do. So we're going to cover this in the next session as well, I swear.
Sounds good. And also to keep in mind, sometimes you think, a certain group is promoted or gets salary increases easier than another. It might also have to do with third factors, like what job level do you find people in? Are certain genders, for example, more represented in certain job levels than others? Obviously, another diversity issue there, but this is where you can really dig into that type of stuff once you actually do the analysis. So once it's all signed off by execs, then another tricky part is manager actually communicating the compensation stuff. So this is also we'll get more into in the second part of our webinar. So next time we see each other in a week, really investing in manager training. This is something that's missed all too often, especially in companies that are rather young maybe or small. You want to invest in manager training in general from the get-go. Managers are the columns that carry your organization. The more managers are enabled, the less HR you will need, the more things will run organically by themselves. So making sure that there's training, they're aligned, they're aware and educated on the philosophy your company has, the values, what they should communicate and share, what they shouldn't. So this creates really where ultimately the fairness also comes to play. And you also want to make sure that they do communicate the salary changes rather than not communicating them at all. So whatever you do and all the effort you put in as a company, which obviously, this is really admirable once you actually go through the process and you have something in place that makes sure things are as fair as they can be, that people are aware of it. More often than not, also in the benefit space, for example, the company offers and does great things. No one knows about them. You just get a decision kind of, maybe a piece of paper put on your table. Actually, there was something a friend of mine told me the other day. We met again after like 10 years of doing our studies in London. And he was like, oh, guess what? I got a massive promotion, a massive salary increase, but it didn't really land because it was just a piece of paper that was put on my table. And it just comes to a little bit of a disappointment, right? So you don't really want this to happen.
It's such a massive missed opportunity by a company that puts a lot of budget and efforts into promoting and giving a large increase and not even seizing the opportunities to make it a very formal, great. It should be one of the best moments of the year in terms of employer-employee relationship, and it gets wasted by just receiving a dull paper or something like that. It drives me nuts when I see that in terms of missed opportunity.
Absolutely, because it's just a number at the end of the day. But if you think about it, ultimately that's the main exchange you'll have with employees on a monthly basis, however often you pay out their salary. So managers will then communicate the salary changes to the employees, ideally in a very successful, highly educated way. Salaries are effective, so they don't become effective necessarily when they're communicated. You'll communicate them before. Usually they're effective on the 1st of any particular month, so maybe 1st of June, 1st of January, whichever. And then obviously also it's important, you need to update your payroll providers so that the changes are also reflected in their pay slips and not just in your HR tool and verbally communicated to them. And then one last point I'd like to share with you before we go into the Q&A and finish off this round is to always, whatever you do in HR, especially with these types of HR programs, to take time once the whole salary review is done to review what went well, what didn't go well, what do we keep, stop, start, continue the next time, because it's an iterative process. Not because processes are necessarily bad or good at any particular point in time, but also the company changes, it develops, it grows, different types of employees come in, more input, new ideas. So it's important to review and update where necessary.
So one thing on sorry, there was a few questions in the chat. First of all, the latest question from Julia is a good transition point, right? How to support leaders in prioritizing their budget during salary reviews. This is exactly what we're going to start with in the next session. We're going to stop here. And to one point that was mentioned beforehand, right? One key thing on that, a quick teaser for next session. If you have discretionary, if your organization is you give a budget to manager and you're okay, decide whatever you want, decide whomever should get increased and that's it, you need to change it. If you have that type of process when it comes to compensation review, this needs to change. Why? Get back to some of the introduction we had today. You need to justify any compensation decision with objective, non-discriminatory reason, right? And if your answer is your manager decided, your manager had a budget and decided, it's not a great position to be in. So in fact, my view, and in fact, we'll share next time a paper I've read since we prepared the slides, right? That should be heavily HR suggested and just occasionally adjusted per managers. But the norm should be HR suggested fair increases based on performance, competency assessment, bond positioning. We're going to cover that next time. And that then it should be only manual adjustment with managers rather than the other way around, when it seems that the norm is in most companies, manager suggestion and then some HR reviews, right? But we're going to cover that next time. And now time for questions before we get over. We're going to recap and go over some of the questions we've highlighted in the chat. Please ask some more questions so that we can cover. Let's go. Or maybe we cover the question from Clayton, which is tied to company reviews. Now we're going to cover it next time, Clayton. Same thing. How do you take into consideration dates since last increase in terms of compensation review cycle? It's an interesting question. And I keep teasing next time, but we had to slice it in two, right? Once again, next time we're going to have to cover compensation review, how to adjust pay based on location, one of the first questions we had in the chat, how to manage employees out of band, salary bands analytics. So we have a packed agenda for next time. Going over to some of the questions we had since the beginning of this session, and we had a lot of them, right? But let's go back to a question on, I think question from William was how do you handle exceptions, right? We're going to cover this a little bit of next time as well. But you have a teaser on how do you manage people that are much higher than what they should be given on range, right? Do you create a specific range for those roles or those people so that they fit into a theoretical range, or do you manage them to be way above any type of range they should be attached to? Like those exceptions, how do you manage those? Do you have any rough idea or rough answer to this one, Marie? It's a tricky question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say with most things in HR, especially as Virginia was saying earlier, you have to have a rationale of why you're making these decisions. I'm personally a big proponent of make exceptions if you have to, but also make sure there's a rationale behind that. Always imagine if everyone wants to know about this decision, is there a way you can actually rationalize it and defend whatever decision you made? So this usually involves also having a plan of what happens after. Very rarely will people just make adjustments outside of a salary range and then not really see what they're going to do later, because the problem you're running into potentially is that the employee might have negotiated successfully or not, or just been given a salary increase outside of a range and therefore are now an outlier. And then unlikely is it that next time they will be expecting the same salary adjustment. But also keep in mind that might also just not be possible, right? You're giving them a huge increase now, maybe outside of the range. Make sure that they understand next time it's not necessarily going to have to be the same, that there's a certain contingency tied to that, right? So maybe there's a certain expectation of, they're taking on a stretch role for the next couple of months, and then now things are moving back to where they were before, or there's just no room for promotion right now. You're really trying to keep them. Maybe a salary increase is also not what they're looking for. Maybe you can also retain people by having something called retention bonuses. So Google, for example, applied that very freely. Well, not freely, but like they did apply it also sometimes in large amounts. For example, when they were acquiring different companies, you can't necessarily give people a salary increase or base salary that just goes to the moon. But especially with companies that they would acquire, where certain engineers in particular would hold particular intellectual property and knowledge that was essential for the company for them to stick around, you give out retention bonuses, which in those areas might be into the hundreds of thousands of millions, depending on how valuable they are. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it's a nice tool, for example, to be like, hey, we can't adjust your salary or your base salary out of fairness, but in order to retain you, maybe every 6 months you receive an additional couple of thousands on top, and that's maybe also time limited. So you always need to be looking into the future. What does your decision right now mean in the future? Is there an expectation that this is going to continue on? Is this an exception? Is this justified in this particular case or not? So Jenny, I would say, yes, make exceptions where you have to, be careful about them, have a rationale, but also look at other tools that you might have in your portfolio of things. Base salary is not the only thing you can dial on to, have people have a great employee experience.
Yep. And I think one thing that I want to reemphasize based on what we said, anytime you make an exception, I love having a place like we have a compensation log here where any decision needs to be justified and we keep track of the decision. Any exception needs to be justified. Anytime you get someone into outside of the bands, way above the band, or you do something unusual, keep track of what was the rationale behind it. I think is a great, whatever the exception is a great way to be future-proof in the pay transparency era, but also force yourself to write down the logic. And if you can't come up with reasons other than, well, the guy just negotiated well, I think that's an issue. We're going to discuss that. Yeah, go for it, Mai.
Track record of your decisions is because not everyone's going to stick around, right? The HR personal compensation person might not be here in half a year to be able to remember all of this. So this is why great tools, great processes, taking notes of things really makes a difference.
There was two questions by Clayton and someone else down the chat on how to manage salary bands communication. To go very quick because we have 7 minutes left. I used to be a personal believer into sharing, being more and more transparent when it comes to salary band. Now, once again, pay transparency laws are going to force you to be more and more transparent down the road. So it's good to start preparing now. I think the best approach I've seen, the most pragmatic approach I've seen, that I've seen as part of some of our clients that are going through or that have gone through those approaches, like start sharing the salary bands through leadership and HR first, then start sharing some of the salary bands to your managers belonging to their direct reports and so on, along with trainings, where you need to train your manager, right? And I think it's one more responsibility for them to be able to understand compensation policy, salary band, and so on. I think it's a necessary one. And once you have that, start sharing those to employees. the first step when you want to start salary bands to your employee, you don't have to share the whole salary band for the whole company. You just share with each employee their position and their own salary band, right? And I think that's that's going to be the norm, like 3-4 years time from now. That's going to be more and more of the norm. Employees will know their position with their salary band. Once again, tied to the Pay Transparency Directive. And this is what this process of like leadership and HR, then managers, then employees, and by the way, then candidates through the job ad, which is the last step, to me, is a very rational, pragmatic approach that works well. We've seen many companies starting to share salary bands to managers, and now the first one sharing to employees using figures, right? And the feedback is, I've met, in fact, 2 managers recently that have access to salary bands of their direct report and position within salary bands of their direct reports through figures. And they're like, it's great having access to that kind of information, understanding the logic, being able to answer to employees' questions. And I think that's the best pragmatic approach. Leadership, HR, managers, employees, and then candidates. If I go down some of the list of some of the questions I've noted down that we should take, we had a question. Yeah, a question from Demi on what's your tip for creating the salary band for smaller companies? I would suggest, once again, watching the salary band creation webinar. If you don't have traditional way or good way of defining what is a junior, intermediate, senior employee, you need to start there, right? Do you agree, Marie? Leveling framework is the first step for salary band.
Yeah, totally. And you see this with companies, for example, that are applying the holacracy framework where, everyone is kind of like a project-based person and you kind of jump around. It can work. You'll probably need some sort of other defining factor. Companies usually use maybe tenure. How long have you been around? So you get like a percentage increase with each year that you're around. But there's usually pitfalls to it. Most companies eventually will move to, a job leveling framework with career tracks, divided into different departments, because it does make these types of decisions fairer and easier for everyone involved, rather than having a little bit of an assortment of different types of people and then being very individual, because exactly there is when the biases come in. Exactly there is where you'll see that those who negotiate well will have the advantage, and that's exactly what you're trying to avoid.
Yeah. There was a question from Jennifer on out-of-band employees and do people have a hard ceiling on salary band? We're going to cover that next time. I'd say this, most companies don't have a hard ceiling, but most companies have a way to slow down or stop compensation progression if you're outside of the band, like above salary band, and we're going to cover that next time. There was some question if we're still going down the road. What are some of the next questions? We had a question on, I think there was a question from, I'm sorry, we had a lot of those. From Sam. For Sam, you have a lot of, we seem that you're a company where you don't have a lot of help and support from leadership on defining budgets and so on. I think there was some good recommendation on the chat and what we discussed. Let us know if that's not the case, right? Hopefully that should give you a good basis to start negotiating a more fair and structured process within your own company. And by the way, using upcoming legislation and pay transparency laws as a way to lobby internally is a good way. When you talk about legislation and compliance, CEOs sometimes tend to, on leadership, to hear more than in the past. Do you have, I keep going down, do you see a question we haven't covered? I keep going down.
Even the last ones that popped in.
I'm getting to the last one, considering there's 2 minutes left. We're going to discuss that, Jevita, same thing, overpaying someone, exception, we cannot discuss that. How do we account for retention bonus and salary band? Oh, that's a good one, reacting to one of your questions. To me, it's managed outside of the band. You need to keep track of that, but it's not something that impacts position with the band. And it's also something linked to welcome bonuses or sign-on bonuses, right?
Exactly.
It's actually a good way sometimes to keep salaries within bands at higher time, but giving them something to match some of the gap between what you can offer them to stay within the band and their expectation. I've been using a sign-on as an exceptional measure from time to time, and I think it's a good measure to still maintain solid salary band while having some flexibility. What do you think, Marie?
Absolutely. And unfortunately for the employee, there's a slight disadvantage to it, right? Because at first it kind of sounds nice, but it doesn't do anything for you long term. Just like it helps to get the large salary increase now rather than it trickle in over time, bit by bit, because ultimately you'll have more monetary advantage from that. But yes, it's an important tool to kind of bridge that gap, as you said, because you ideally, as a company, from an HR point of view, from a company point of view, you don't want to tweak with the base salary too much. This is really the base structure of where you really want to keep it as within the frame and aligned across the company as you possibly can. There's other things you can do, also in the benefit space, adding additional benefits here and there. But usually when you offer sign-on bonuses, retention bonuses, it's an easy tool, just a communication to payroll rather than a whole other administrative realm of options that you need to open.
And I'll take the last question. I'm sorry if there's some that we haven't covered in the chat, but once again, we have another session and we'll keep more room for Q&A potentially at the other session. I love this question from Julia. It's more of a philosophical question. What do you do with counter offers? My personal stance most of my career, I've been very much against counter offers because I think the greater good is maintaining a robust system that doesn't leave too much room for negotiation. So I said I've done very, very few of them. And in fact, I've had heated discussion with managers and leaderships about this, being like, and one of the things I've used in those discussions, which is one of your questions, what can you use internally? There's a lot of study on like the retention of people that you've retained with counter offers being super low. In fact, people you retain with counter offers have a super high chance of leaving anyway within the next 2 years. So whenever you break your process and allow for counter offers, you might send a signal to everyone else. You want to get a pay increase, start interviewing elsewhere, come back with an offer, and then match it. Which, by the way, which is something we used to do quite a bit in the US because that's more of the spirit and the norm of the market. But I hated it because it sends a message to everyone. If you want to pay increase, go interview elsewhere. And so whenever you match, you can do a counter offer to someone. You might send this message to everyone. You might compromise the fairness of your compensation structure. And the person might end up leaving anyway within a year or two, which is what happened most of the time. So that's my take on it. Marie?
And there's also other components that you can tweak, right? So often this is where VSOP, ESOP comes in, so shares or stock options they're giving employees, but also there you need to be careful that you don't overdo it because there's always a certain allotted amount. And this is where you see maybe some of the unfairness also coming in sometimes. And some people are very good at negotiating these stock option packages. But yes, completely agree. It's not supposed to be a competition. Also, you're not necessarily always going to get proof of what the actual counteroffer is, right? And you want people to join your company for your company and not just the compensation. You can then further down the line, make sure you retain them by having proper compensation processes, giving regular salary increases and communicating those well. That will do much more for your retention, including good onboarding and all the other hygiene factors than, showering them with money. You'd be surprised to see how little that actually motivates people further down the line. Career development and a lot of the other aspects are way better in leveraging retention.
And we'll end with that. 2 minutes over time. We had a lot of questions. Good thing we have part 2. Once again, we'll share part 2, the link to part 2 in the chat. Part 2, we're going to cover the end of compensation review, managing employees out of band, communication, location factors, analytics. There's quite a heavy agenda for part 2. I hope you like part 1.